All right, let's dive into another case, shall we? Today, it's the truly disturbing story of Herb Balmeister, a serial killer from Indianapolis.
Ah, Herb Balmeister. A fascinating case, to say the least.
Yeah, and we're focusing on just one source today, a single true crime podcast episode about him.
Okay, great. So, are we going to try and piece together like a timeline or maybe focus on a specific aspect of the case?
Well, I think what's really got me intrigued is just how much of his childhood seemed to foreshadow his later actions. I mean, it's almost like there were these early warnings, even beyond, the usual difficult childhood stuff.
Right, right. And you're not kidding. This podcast doesn't just talk about typical childhood issues. We're talking like a fascination with urine, even putting a dead bird on his teacher's desk.
Oh, yeah, that was messed up.
Seriously disturbing stuff.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, were these early signs or just, a really messed up kid?
Well, what's really fascinating is that these actions, they line up with what's known as the McDonald triad.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so it's like this set of three behavioral traits: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals. And, they've been linked to later violent tendencies. So, like you said, this isn't just, boys will be boys kind of stuff.
No, definitely not. So even back then, there could have been some clues about the path he'd take, right?
Exactly. And it becomes even more significant because the podcast mentions that Baumeister's father, he knew about these behaviors, like he was aware of them. And there's even some talk about potential diagnoses of schizophrenia and, get this, multiple personalities.
Wow, multiple personalities.
Yeah, it's wild, right? But it seems like if there was any treatment at all, it was really limited.
So they knew, but maybe they didn't do enough. It's hard not to wonder if early intervention, could have changed things. Right?
Yeah.
Prevented what happened later.
Yeah, that question kind of hangs over the whole case, doesn't it? And it's even more, poignant when you consider how different his public image was from the reality of his actions.
Right? Like a total double life. On the surface, you've got this successful businessman, family man. He even seemed to project this image of, conservative values.
Yeah, totally. But then underneath, you had a guy who was frequenting gay bars, preying on men. I mean, he's suspected of murdering at least 21 people.
Chilling. It just shows you how appearances can be so deceiving.
Totally. And it makes you wonder how he pulled it off for so long, How did he manage to keep those two worlds separate?
Such a good question. Was it all just a calculated act, or did he actually believe he was living these two separate lives?
It's hard to say. We might never really know what was going on in his head. But what we do know is that as more and more men started disappearing from Indianapolis, that facade started to crumble.
Yeah, and that's where the podcast gets into this, really frustrating aspect of the case, the delayed response from the police. Can you believe there was actually a 30-day waiting period before they could even investigate a missing person?
Seriously, that's crazy.
I know, right? It's hard to imagine the families just desperate for answers while the authorities are basically telling them to wait.
Ugh, it's heartbreaking. They had to hire a private investigator, go to the media, just to get anyone to take them seriously. And it gets even more complicated because the podcast mentions disappearances in Ohio, too, linked to Baumeister's business trips.
Oh, wow. So this was more widespread than just Indianapolis.
It seems like it. And it makes you wonder, how long had this been going on? How many more people might have been safe if someone had connected the dots sooner?
Yeah, it's scary to think about. And then there's Tony's story, which is just terrifying. But it's also super important to the whole investigation.
Tony's encounter with Baumeister, who was using a fake name at the time, is straight out of a nightmare. He meets him at a gay bar, gets invited back to this huge mansion.
Sounds pretty normal so far, actually.
Yeah, well, hold on. He gets there and he finds himself in a pool room, right? But it's full of mannequins, dressed up and posed like they're guests at a party.
Mannequins. Okay, that's just creepy.
Right. And as if that wasn't weird enough, Baumeister then tries to choke Tony with a pool hose, claiming it was part of, some kind of consensual thing.
Whoa. So he barely escaped with his life.
Yeah.
But I guess that's how he ended up becoming such a key witness.
Exactly. Tony's experience provided these crucial clues, even though, sadly, the police didn't believe him at first.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just dismissed his story.
That's awful.
It really shows how dangerous it can be when societal biases influence an investigation. Imagine being a victim, you survive this horrific experience, but then you're not believed because of who you are.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Totally. We have to do better.
Absolutely. We have to believe victims, listen to their stories.
100%.
Tony's experience really highlights how important that is.
Yeah, no doubt. Justice delayed can be justice denied, right?
It sure can.
And it's even harder when those victims are already facing, discrimination and skepticism.
Yeah, like you said, we have to do better. And then, of course, there's Julie Balmeister, Herb's wife.
Oh, yeah, Julie. The podcast talks about her initial reaction being, like, complete disbelief. Like, she just couldn't accept it.
I mean, can you blame her? Imagine finding out that your husband, the person you built a life with, is a serial killer. That's got to be, like, totally mind-blowing.
No, totally. I get it. It's like, how do you even process that? Your whole reality is shattered.
Right. It's almost like a textbook case of cognitive dissonance, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Cognitive dissonance. You've got these conflicting beliefs, right? And your brain's trying to make sense of them. So in Julie's case, the idea of Herb being a killer just completely clashed with her image of him as a husband and father.
Yeah, so she just shuts it down, doesn't want to believe it.
Exactly. It's a defense mechanism, right?
Yeah.
It's not until the police show up at their house and her own son finds bones on their property that things start to change for her.
Oh, man, that's got to be horrifying. For her, and especially for her son. Can you imagine finding something like that in your own backyard?
I can't even imagine. And at first, they thought the bones were like an anatomy skeleton or something.
Oh, really? Yeah, but it turned out to be a pretty grim foreshadowing of what they were going to find at Fox Hollow Farms.
Fox Hollow Farms, that's where it all really came crashing down, right?
Exactly. They start excavating the property, and they uncover the remains of 11 bodies.
11 bodies. It's just like the scale of it is mind-blowing.
I know, right? All victims of Herb Balmeister buried on his own property.
It's crazy. And then there's this detail about the skulls.
The missing skulls. Yeah, it's bizarre. A lot of the bodies, they didn't have skulls.
Why would he do that? I mean, it seems so specific, almost ritualistic,
It's definitely strange. Some people think it was a way to make identification harder, to prevent the police from connecting the bodies to the missing men.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I wonder if there could be something more to it, like something psychological.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some theories suggest that it was about dehumanizing the victims, making it easier for him to, like, disconnect from the act of murder. Ugh, that's chilling. Like, he's trying to erase their identity completely. And what about the families? Imagine not even having a complete body to bury.
It's awful. That lack of closure has to be devastating. And then on top of everything else, Baumeister manages to escape. He takes off to Michigan before the police can catch him.
Seriously. So they were this close to getting him, and he just slips away.
Yep. Another layer of frustration to this whole story. You've got all these unanswered questions, years of pain and suffering, and the guy responsible just vanishes.
Oh, I bet that was infuriating.
And then, in a final act of, I don't know, defiance maybe, he takes his own life, leaves behind a suicide note too.
Oh, wow. Did he explain anything in the note? Like, did he confess or give any reasons for what he did?
It's weird. The note focuses mostly on his business troubles and his marriage falling apart. Doesn't mention the murders at all. Not a word.
It's almost like he was trying to rewrite his own story, even in death. Pretend like none of it happened.
Or maybe he was so disconnected from reality that he couldn't even face what he had done, even in his final moments.
Either way, it's disturbing, right? No remorse, no answers. It just adds to the mystery. But the story doesn't end there, does it? The podcast talks about the aftermath, how this whole thing affected the families, the community.
Yeah, and that's where the real tragedy lies, I think. Those families, they were robbed of their loved ones, but also of the chance to confront their killer, to get any kind of justice.
Yeah, that's got to be so hard. And what about Julie and the kids? Their whole world just imploded overnight. To find out that your husband, your father, was capable of something so horrific, I can't imagine the pain.
It's unimaginable. And then there's the community, too, the sense of betrayal, right? This realization that someone they thought they knew was living this double life. It shakes your faith in everything.
Right, like who can you trust? But even in all this darkness, there's a glimmer of hope, isn't there? The way the families and the community came together to support each other, to find strength in shared grief.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They found ways to honor their loved ones, to keep their memories alive.
It's inspiring, really. And it reminds us that even in the face of tragedy, we can find connection, support, and ultimately healing.
Exactly. And speaking of finding meaning, there's this one detail from the podcast that I keep coming back to. Do you remember the story about Baumeister and the painted over raccoon?
Oh, yeah, that was a weird one. They played a clip of him being interviewed about this road crew that accidentally painted over a dead raccoon on the street.
Right, and he's totally outraged, like genuinely upset about this. He even takes pictures, like it's some kind of crime scene.
It's almost funny in a dark way, you know? Here's this guy, the serial killer, and he's
Yeah.
all worked up over a raccoon getting a little extra paint.
It's bizarre, right? Makes you question everything you thought you knew about him. Like, was it an act? Was he trying to appear compassionate? Or was there something else going on in his head?
It's hard to say. Maybe it was just another example of that compartmentalization we were talking about. This ability to hold these completely contradictory ideas in his mind at the same time.
It's definitely possible. And it's a reminder that even when we think we're getting close to understanding someone like Herb Baumeister, there are always going to be these layers of mystery and complexity.
Yeah, it's a weird one for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not every day you hear a serial killer getting all riled up over a raccoon.
Right. It's like, dude, you killed how many people? And
Yeah.
you're worried about some roadkill getting a fresh coat of paint.
Seriously. Makes you wonder what was going on in his head.
I know, right? It's like he was living in this alternate reality or something.
Maybe. Or maybe he just didn't see the connection. Like in his mind, those things weren't even related.
It's scary to think about.
Yeah, it is. And it kind of brings us back to the missing skulls, doesn't it? I mean, we talked about it earlier, but it's just such a strange detail. 11 bodies, but so many of them missing their skulls. Why?
I know, it's a real head scratcher. Some experts think it was all about hindering identification, making it harder for the cops to connect the dots, you know?
Right. But could there be more to it than that? Like something deeper, something more psychological?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, think about it. The skull, it's like the ultimate symbol of identity, right?
Yeah.
So removing it, it's almost like this final act of dehumanization. Like he's erasing their personhood completely.
Yeah, that's disturbing. And the families, they don't even have a complete body to bury. That's got to be rough.
No kidding. It adds this whole other layer of trauma to an already horrific situation. And then, of course, you've got the fact that Baumeister escaped.
Yeah, that he got away with it in a way. I mean, he took his own life before he could face any real consequences.
That's right, left behind that suicide note, too. But it didn't really shed any light on things, did it?
No, not really. It was all about his failed business and his marriage. Not a single word about the murders. Like he was trying to pretend none of it ever happened.
Or maybe he was just so good at compartmentalizing, you know, blocking out the bad stuff, even from himself.
Yeah, it's a mystery. And I guess it's going to stay that way. We may never fully understand what made him tick, why he did what he did.
That's true, and that can be frustrating, right? But maybe that's also part of what makes these cases so fascinating. The fact that there are always going to be some unanswered questions.
Yeah, I guess so. It's like this puzzle you can never quite solve.
Exactly. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to solve the puzzle, but to just keep trying, to keep searching for answers, even if we know we might never find them all.
That's a good way to look at it.
Ugh.
And I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today. Herb Balmeister, a truly disturbing case full of twists and turns and questions that may never be answered.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think.
It does. And hopefully it also reminds us to be vigilant, to listen to those around us, and to speak up when we see something that doesn't feel right. Because sometimes the most ordinary seeming people can be hiding the darkest secrets.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for diving into this case with me. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.